Hello, Lena. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Thank you.
And so it's a strange day today because we were scheduled to speak about your chapter in the book, Dispatches from a Time Between Worlds. And it's got a very evocative title of, But Do You Have a Vegetable Garden? And it's a sort of study of what it means to think of the economy from a metamodern perspective. And it's a great chapter and we'd love to talk about it. But on the other hand, today is the day that Russia invaded Ukraine, basically, and in quite a big way. And it feels odd to speak about anything else. So I guess I'm just curious to check in with you about what you feel is going on at the moment, first of all, and in what way, if any, it speaks to, or our work speaks to that in any way, or it speaks to us at the moment.
I think these are two things are very much connected, not in the way that most of us have probably, thought of it, but I think that, we are in a time where things are up in the air, where old structures don't hold anymore. And there are people in this world who are desperately longing for the world that they knew, and who are, hoping to go back to a certain kind of stability and predictability that is not there anymore. And so, it's just terrible to watch this invasion going on. It's about 13 hours old as we're speaking right now, and it's just unbearable, and it can go really, really wrong. It can be terrible. It is terrible, but it can be even worse. So I see this as part of a bigger upheaval in geopolitical structures and power structures in economic structures. The metamodern economy that I've written about in the book is about seeing different time epochs and structures in economy that serve different purposes in producing, what sustains us. But these different epochs or cultural codes are also in politics, and they are in political power, institutions of power. They are in the way that we're organizing ourselves as societies, and what we're seeing right now between the West and Russia, and the West and China, and Africa, and the Northern Hemisphere, and all these different major structures around the globe. We're struggling with the aftermath of colonialism. There's so many structures that are being, they used to hold us in a certain way, and now they're, losing their grip. And then you have individuals with a very strong agenda, with maybe even a manic attitude, and who are in the throes of their fear or anger or sense of pride, and now they see the cracks opening, and there's room for action, and without consideration for other people. And I think in this situation, it is very much about meaning making. It's about how do we all understand, how do we make sense of the world? And if you're making sense of the world from a postmodern perspective, nothing has real depth. There are no power. There are no quality hierarchies, and there is everything is relative to everything else, and nothing really matters. And you can do that when you live in the safety and comfort of the Western world as we've known it for the past 30 years. Postmodernism is a product of safety and security. And that safety and security is pretty much gone as of this night. And so I think there's a lot of postmodernism that is just going to vanish right now. And then we have the modern world, and we have it in the democratic human rights, humanity, humane sense. And then we have the hyper-modern, abusive industrialization, people crushing version, where profit and measurement goals and the sort of materialism defines what is success and what is failure. And so the modern world isn't just either good or bad. I mean, it does have a number of different aspects also, but there are things that you can do in the modern world with science and technology and political infrastructure that you could not do in the pre-modern world. And so we still also have all that pre-modern stuff, which is religion, which is moral norms. There is the cultural heritage that later in the modern world becomes the nation state sense of identity as a people, which is very much connected to language and literature and the arts and whole symbolic worlds. But a lot of these symbolic worlds that we enjoy in the modern world and which we deconstruct in the postmodern world have their roots in the pre-modern traditional world. And so in the UK, you have the Church of England, and you have a bunch of references there. I know you're from Scotland. I mean, you have all the kilts and stuff. I mean, you have symbols from up there, and I'm from Denmark, and we have our symbols. And in Ukraine, they have theirs, and they have a sense of being Ukrainian. And in Russia, they have the Russian symbols and the Russian tradition, and they have amazing art, and they have the Bolshoi theater, and they got ballet, and they got all kinds of stuff. And part of this traveled into the modern world and is still part of the meaning making. And then before that, before the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, we had the Stone Age, and we had, early agriculture and nomadic tribes, and we had hunter-gatherers and all that stuff. And the reason why we need to take that into account is that we spent 200,000 years as modern human beings living in the Stone Age, and we're still born like those people. I mean, our brains are Stone Age brains, and then we've added all this complexity and culture over the course of the pre-modern era, the modern era, and in postmodernity. And now we're at some place in time where we can't figure things out anymore because things are too complex, and that's where we have this metamodernism and metamodernity discussion. Because we're trying to figure out how can this world be meaningful in the future? What is it we're doing? Who are we? And you also know that because you edited the book and I wrote the chapter on the metamodern economy, that I claim that we need to talk about metamodernity that takes into account these really big four modes of being. And of course, through history, it wasn't like one day they just shifted from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age and then everything in their mind went in another direction. This was a gradual development, but there were also all these wars and these transitions. And so that is where we are right now. And I don't think we're fundamentally seeing something new, but we could handle this in new ways, and we will handle this in new ways. The question is, how successful are we going to be at that? But the metamodernism, which is then I guess the major part of this book, and also has defined very much the discussion about the metamodern, is more of a sensibility. It's an emotional sort of superposition between the modern and the postmodern. It's this sort of double bind in your sense of there's the modern world where we have the sincerity and we have the science and the facts, and then we have the postmodernism that can deconstruct everything, and we have the ironical distance to everything, and we harbor both emotions, and we can't really figure out to settle on either one, because both of them are crucial for making sense of the world and to our meaning making, the way that we're living in this complex world that we're in right now. And I think that these ways of understanding are very much connected to also the communication technologies that we have at certain points in time. And if we go way back, I mean, there was the storytelling around the campfire. And then there was, storytelling and oral messages as you traveled from group to group. Once we get into the Bronze Age and Iron Age, we have the first writing, and it's in clay tablets or, ink on parchment, whatever, but you have to hand it over to people, and you can only make copies by handwriting. And then we get into the modern world, which really starts with Gutenberg's printing press with movable type. And now you can mass produce text, and you can have many people receiving the same message. And then we get into an even more modern world with the electronic media, so mass communication via radio and television. And now we are in the postmodern world that has had the video recorder, the tape recorder. I mean, today it feels like very, very far away that you had a tape recorder or a video VCR when you can communicate with the entire world on your cell phone via social media. But it's still part of the same thing. Everybody became a producer of mass communication, and now it's gone insane. And in that, I can communicate to the entire world situation, it makes total sense that we have wokeness, that we have critical race theory, that we have intersectionality, that we have all these concepts of different perspectives that are layered or interacting somehow with each other. And that's a very, very complex understanding of the world. And we absolutely need that very complex understanding of the world. What we do not need is that we have people who preach tolerance, but do it in an intolerant way. And I think here we're back to the sort of overall question of meaning making, which is, can you handle that people disagree with you? Can you handle that other people have the freedom to be wrong, that other people have the freedom to be an asshole, pardon my French, but other people have the freedom to do something that you don't like, and to print, read, have in libraries books with offensive content. And if you cannot handle that, it's not the library's problem, it's your problem. Unless what is written and printed or produced, expressed in the media are actually threats to other people or calls for violence or any kind of crime, really. If it's just because you don't like it, what people are saying, you can't. I mean, that is where we need to enter into a conversation, and you have to be able to express, why do I think this is wrong, morally wrong? Why do I think you should shut up? Why do I think you're hurting me and other people for no good reason? And this difference between being able to handle that other people may be wrong, maybe saying offensive things, maybe wanting to live their life as an independent state without your military telling them how to behave. That is part of your maturity as an adult. It's part of Bildung, which is what I focus on in my work, but it's also part of how can we handle this postmodern, metamodern, complex world where we will have to live next door to, collaborate with people who are different from ourselves. And I think one of the things that we're struggling with, which is a heritage from all civilization that we have known, is that the vast majority of us, until really maybe a generation ago, have lived in societies where you assumed that people had just one cultural identity, because you grew up more or less in the same place, and if there were different migration waves and refugees and stuff like that, wars, there were no sort of hesitations towards just killing people you didn't like. And we agree now that that's not the right thing to do on this day. I know that others disagree with that right now, but part of a metamodern world and part of being an adult in a complex world is that you grow up to the point in your life where you can handle that other people have viewpoints and lifestyles and values and agendas that are different from yours. And yes, that may feel very, very, unpleasant, and it may rub you the completely wrong way. But unless it actually harms you, you'll just have to learn to deal with it inside yourself and not by enforcing your way of doing things on other people. And that is very hard, and it's something that we learn. And 5-year-olds cannot do it, 10-year-olds cannot do it, 12-year-olds hopefully get to the point where they're beginning to learn how to do it. And when you're 17, we kind of somehow expect it, and when you're 35, we definitely expect that you can do it. So there is this development in how we interact with other people. And one of the philosophers who came with a very clever observation was the German philosopher Fichte, who said that we grow from Anstoß, from pushbacks. And so handling pushbacks, facing viewpoints and facts, I mean, that contradict the way that you think the world is. That is part of your realization. That is part of your Bildung. That is part of your formation as a person. And sometimes you end up realizing that you were wrong. Other times you realize I was right all along, but I did learn from this, and I do understand that other people could be wrong even though I was right. And I'm glad we talked about this, because now I understand where these people are coming from. And likewise, when it's me who's wrong, hopefully I will learn from it. And one of the great things about having a lot of these pushbacks in an early age has to be in a friendly and safe environment, of course, and it cannot be with authoritarian teachers or parents who beat you into thinking the right way. Is that the more you're exposed to different viewpoints, to different cultural inputs, the more that you can broaden your horizon in all kinds of fields, in music, in movies, in science, in math, in geography. I mean, all the stuff that they, pour into your head in school. The more of that you're faced with, and the more you explore different ways of expressing what it means to be human, the more you also struggle with this content and realize, so who am I? What is it that I find meaningful? What is it that makes things worth pursuing for me? I like this kind of music because I can dance to it. And other people don't like dancing. I'm actually terrible at dancing, but I do like it. Other people think, I can sit here in the corner and listen to this amazing jazz music, and I can hear all these different patterns in the music. And the more complex and weird it is, I mean, the better. And other people are like, oh, that's just horrible. I want some, I want to be able to dance and jump and hit the beat, and that's good music. And these two kinds of people very often cannot agree on what is good music, and they can be, almost at war. So we have these different ways of perceiving what is true and good, and what does it mean to be a good human being. And when we start making these sort of conglomerates of cultural identities that go together and oppose them to other conglomerates of cultural entities and identities that go together, that is very often where we get into trouble, because then you have sort of a groupthink, and we have prejudice, and we have this sense of, if I am let's say I'm white, I'm a woman in my 50s, I'm Danish, and I actually, from a global perspective, is extremely privileged. I can't deny that. You're a white guy from the British Isles, and let's face it, you're pretty privileged too. So we come with a heritage, an identity, a way that we look, with a cultural, suitcase, and people will see us in a certain way. And if one of those aspects triggers a whole package of assumptions, and likewise, if we see somebody who is from China or Africa, or who has a different profession from ours, and that comes with this whole package of assumptions, then first of all, we're not meeting the individual, but we're also risking that we're actually being had, instead of having all these, identities, like having a taste for this kind of music, having this culture, having these political observations, having this ethnicity, this gender, the sex, and making that whole package part of who I am. If one of them starts taking over my personality and everything is defined through that one thing, that can be nationality. I mean, I could be like a, national chauvinist who just sees everything through a Danish or non-Danish lens. Then it becomes dangerous, particularly if I cannot transcend that one part of my personality, that part of who I am and what I identify with. Could be sex, could be color, could be any of these. And so once you have, if you only have one identity, so if we have not provided kids with a lot of cultural input, with a lot of knowledge, a lot of different, exposing them to different political ideologies when they're in their teen years, if we're not taking them traveling and seeing other cultures, if we're not exposing them to conflicting viewpoints, if we're just sort of force feeding them or giving them one story about what it means to be, say, Swedish, and that gets to define their whole being, then they're being had by that one ideology or idea or identity, and then it becomes very vulnerable. And once you then have somebody who sort of tries to fight your Swedishness or challenge what it means to be Swedish, it's very painful, because if it turns out that everything you thought about Sweden was right and it turns out to be wrong, you lose your identity. But if you have, okay, so I'm Swedish, I'm a left-wing feminist, I'm also a jazz fan, and I love 3 different kinds of sports, and they all make up, who I am as an individual. If somebody then attacked my music taste or my nationality, it's not as painful because there's other stuff inside me. There are other things that it's just a fraction of who I am. So we need all this in order to develop a healthy personality as young adults and as adults. But we also need it in order to be able to understand, people who are different from ourselves, and be able to have civilized discussions where we disagree. And the more pushbacks we have had, the more that we have had to revise our assumptions about the world. There are usually 2 outcomes. One is that you actually know why you think the way that you do. I mean, you confirm or you have about why you think the way that you do, and you think about why I think this is right. And so you become more aware of why you think the way that you do, and you have better arguments for it, and you may actually have a better case. But you may also become more humble because you realize that there was that time last year where it turned out that I was completely wrong, and there were all these people who knew what the right answer was, and I just looked like an idiot. And so once you've gotten over that feeling a couple of times, like, oh, what an idiot I was, you become a much more pleasant person for everybody else. So in this situation where we are now, which is really horrible, I see this very much as a meaning-making crisis, a meaning-making challenge, a cultural disaster, because we have, it's obvious that both the Russians want to be Russian and the Ukrainians want to be Ukrainian, and that sense of collective identity is important if you want to have a functioning country, and if you want to have a public debate, and to have a public discourse. You have to have some level of shared cultural references. You have to have some level of shared sense of identity and trust. And you have to have, a language where the words mean more or less the same things in order to have that discussion. But you also have to have that sense of, I could be wrong. I'm not, there are other viewpoints, and I'm not only Russian or not only Ukrainian. I'm also a bunch of other stuff. And so I think to connect this to the whole metamodernity thing, the more that we have from, our roots, the richer we are on the inside, the more stuff we have that we can refer to and that we can relate to in where we're coming from, the better we are at handling the times that we're in. But we have school systems that have been focusing very much on just, creating a workforce. And so that whole cultural aspect, that whole emotional aspect, and the aspect of being exposed to weird stuff and culture from other civilizations has not been at the forefront of our educational systems, and we're paying for that now.
So I was smiling a little bit there just because it was quite an extraordinary monologue, and I think you went for about 27 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. And I didn't want to interrupt you.
You didn't say anything, so and you looked as if you were listening. So I was
very much listening and enjoying, and I also didn't want to interrupt because, it began with a question about Russia and Ukraine, and who's to say that connecting that to your take on metamodernity with a bit of Bildung thrown in along the way, and all that comprises those major perspectives you have, isn't part of how we sort of therapeutically make sense of the moment, right? There's a sense in which sometimes, they say that, for example, the old cliche is that men connect by talking about football with each other, that they think they're talking about football, but really they're sharing their feelings. They're sort of, they're grooming each other in a certain sense. And so I didn't want to cut you short just because it's sometimes just valuable just to kind of keep talking and to see what comes out. I suppose I wanted to, I know at the end there you rightly indicated that Russia and Ukraine have very deep historical ties, and there are many Russians in Ukraine and vice versa. Many people in Ukraine speak Russian either as a first or second language. I don't know if you've been to Ukraine recently. I was there in 2019. And that makes the news cycle at the moment particularly painful in a way. It's interesting. I think the point of, there are many points to traveling, but one of them is actually that it makes the prospect of war less abstract. If you've been on the streets and seen the people of the place in question, you just think how horrible that this place is now under siege. It's all the more vivid and palpable for that. And in terms of the confusion, it's interesting to understand what's going on here, because this is a war made possible through control of information and willful misinformation, I think. The pretext for the war that's sold to the Russian people, and not everyone buys it. I think it's very important to stress that there are many millions of Russians who think this is a horrific idea, and it's not at all true that everyone's behind this. But those who are against it fear for their freedom and their lives potentially if they are seen to be protesting against it too much. And I don't know, I know a lot of Russian and Ukrainian chess players from my years of playing chess professionally, and my own connection with this issue goes back to 1989, if I'm not mistaken, where I was playing in the European under 14, actually I was 14, but it was the European under 16 championship. And I mention that now because my opponent had the hammer and sickle. I was playing the USSR, and I remember it quite vividly. Vasily Emelin, I think he was called. And then a bit later, I played two other guys playing for the Soviet Union at a tournament in Warsaw. And so the Soviet Union is not that abstract for me. It's not a historical relic. It's a real phenomenon that was there. And then I was at a tournament in London around the time it started to break up. And there were many players there from Latvia, and yeah, I remember all of the former Soviet states. And so this story, the way it's unfolded for me, has been one of a kind of reckoning with history, something about misinformation. I'm also reminded of, the whole issue about petrostates and the issue of Putin's power being in large part reliant on our energy infrastructure. And Putin's kind of alliance with Trump, if that's the right word for it, being grounded in a kind of, well, climate denialism of sorts, denialism broadly conceived. And so although this looks like conventional warfare at one level, it's old-fashioned imperialism of one country making a land grab in another, claiming it as its own. And it is that, that's I don't know where you put that in the code. It has a certain modernist aspect, but it's also pre-modern in a certain sense. But it's done through these codes of nationalist, jingoistic fervor of saving the country from the aggressor, which is clearly bogus. But it is part. I mean, I had a moment. I deleted a tweet this morning. They're always the best tweets. But the one that I was just saying, introducing the meta crisis to war, because we don't, when we talk about the meta crisis, we don't tend to add in addition to, what they sometimes call infocide, or infodemic, they sometimes call it, or ecocide, and then you have all of the usual gamut of things that are driving the meta crisis. You don't add on top of that, and war in Europe, but that's now what we're apparently looking at. And it's hard to see how it could be a good thing. It's hard to see how, anything positive may come from this, beyond the faint hope that somehow this is such obvious, flagrant overreach that there will be a very significant response leading to a loss of power, Putin's power. But more likely, or just as likely, it seems like some kind of emerging axis is taking shape with Xi in China, and you're looking at a big countervailing force to a sort of failing West, where the sort of liberal imaginary that was already under siege looks increasingly feeble and unable to deal with the problems that it is beset by. So I share all that just by way of how I'm processing this at the moment. It's a kind of, I already was under no illusions, like I lost my liberal innocence about 5 years ago. I'm not the kind of person who says, human rights, democracy, and free market capitalism is the way to go in all circumstances. I did grow up with that as my kind of default. I don't think we should take it lightly that that's allowed for a sort of fairly stable and mostly prosperous existence. But I do think that ecological collapse happened on liberalism's watch. And I do think that there's some loss of moral compass and underlying meaning, as you put it, that is somehow a fatal flaw in that whole sort of secular liberal humanist project. And without reconnecting to some kind of source energy that is more, let's say, metaphysical in nature, it will ultimately fall to those who have greater conviction or greater clarity of purpose. But I don't know what that means today for people in the streets of Kiev huddling away from bombs that are raining down from the sky. I mean, the first thing that I feel is Putin must lose. The chess player in me wants to see a very formidable counterattack. Now, presumably that's just economic, but economic combined with political sanctions such that insofar as you can, Russia becomes a pariah state. And I don't know what that looks like really, but and how quickly it can happen and what effect it will have. But my instinct is something like that has to happen. This cannot be countenanced. It cannot become a new normal. And it has to sort of crumble somehow. But I don't honestly feel like that's likely to happen. I feel the West is likely to be too uncoordinated, too irresolute, and that the powers that be in Russia simply don't care that if they're seen in this way. They're not doing a popularity contest. They're imperialist. They want power and strength, and they have enough allies in what looks like Xi's China and potentially even Modi's India. So yeah, I feel this moment with a lot of personal sadness for the sort of people I've met in Ukraine and the sort of vibrancy of that city, Kiev particularly, but the country more generally. And I don't know if we can, I mean, look at it this way. You mentioned the transitions from sort of indigenous to pre-modern, pre-modern to modern, modern to postmodern, and now we're looking at something like postmodern to metamodern. But what's distinctive about that is the metamodern somehow comprises all of the others in some way that is yet to be established, yet to coalesce properly. And I suppose one way of thinking about metamodernity is that it's another way of saying time between worlds, that it's another way of describing, it's the underlying description of what it's like to live in between a world that's dying and a world that hasn't yet been born. And when you put it that way, it sounds lovely and poetic and kind of like, you know, how lovely and romantic to be in this period. But the reality of it is a kind of crumbling of established orders, like we're witnessing today, a kind of two fingers to liberal democracy, two fingers to international law, and a simple, brutal power grab that feels kind of atavistic at a geopolitical level. And yeah, mostly I feel a kind of fear and disquiet about it. I don't yet see it as a kind of useful clearing of the ground or something like that. There are some who feel.
I mean, useful clearing of the ground. I don't think that that's such a thing. I mean, how much ground are we talking about? Because I mean, you can weed out things here and there, and then you can have a transition that is peaceful. But that idea of, you know, clearing the ground and building up something entirely new, I mean, that's the idea of the evolution, and that's where it usually goes wrong. And so, I mean, where we do have institutions, structures of power, and so forth, the challenge is to keep them as peaceful institutions, institutions under democratic control, and ways of, I mean, creating frameworks for us to be able to do all the other, you know, aspects of life in peaceful ways. And when we're looking at, so there are kind of two versions of metamodernism, metamodernity, and then there's the evil cousin, which is hypermodernity. And we risk the hypermodernity. And so what is hypermodernity? Now I described metamodernity as the, you know, bringing together the best from the cultural heritage and a very complex meaning making, allowing us, you know, freedom and expression and cultural richness and so forth, and a very humane world and lush nature, and we save the climate and all that stuff. Hypermodernity is where the market and technology simply take over, and where we have artificial intelligence and robots that make decisions and that are autonomous killer drones and soldiers. And that's going to be terrible. And my biggest fear right now is that that Russia wins in Ukraine, that they will team up with China and use the Chinese surveillance technology to keep everybody under control.
Mhm.
I know that one of the members of Pussy Riot is still in Russia and cannot leave because she wears one of these foot braces. What do you call them? Ankle
Tags, maybe,
braces.
or surveillance
Yeah,
tags, something like that.
exactly. And you have the Sesame credit system in China, where you have, whatever you post on social media and how you behave, whether you pay your bills in time, and if you write the wrong things on social media and so forth, you get credits or you lose credits. And there's also a system where you lose credit by having the wrong friends, and so you're basically being, socially,
Sure.
an outcast if your friends lose points by knowing you. So the so so the sense of all of these technologies can help us create the most amazing future, but the human idea of and drive for controlling other people and not having to face these pushbacks and realizing that I'm wrong sometimes. Bless you. So when we have these, when we try to control everything using technology, that is when we're on the path to hypermodernity.
Right.
And that is not a place where we want to go. And I seriously fear that.
Right. Yeah, me too. And that's an interesting link between the current political development and the kind of epochal challenge, strategic challenge. And I agree that the best case for we may not agree, or rather we may have a different emphasis on how to make the distinctions and what value those distinctions have. But I think we could probably both agree that when we're speaking of the metamodern, that one of its main values is as a kind of antidote to the hypermodern. And that's actually the best, in some ways, even the best way to see it, because you can see it as a kind of what comes after postmodernism, or the postmodern. Again, the ism and itty issue is still there. But I think to really focus people's minds on what's valuable and enchanting and charming about metamodern perspectives is that they are kind of quite humanistic in a certain sense, but
Yes.
deeply humanistic, into going into the deep past. And they're a kind of bulwark against a drift into a sort of dystopian hypermodern sort of world, where our humanity is diminished because we become enslaved by machines, broadly conceived.
And you can say, I wouldn't hesitate to call Nazi Germany for hypermodern,
right,
and the Soviet Union for hypermodern, because they used the technology of their time to control other people, and when they really didn't like them, they killed them.
Right.
And they had no hesitations.
Right.
And you can only do that if you, none of the perpetrators of this thought of themselves as the bad people.
No.
I bet they thought of themselves as the good people. They were convinced that they did the right thing, and they did horrible things. So that is where we get to the pushbacks again, because you need to go through your childhood and your teen years where somebody gives you some pushbacks, so that you get a grip on yourself and can handle not having control over other people.
Right.
And so if you get to the age of 18, your 30s and 40s, and cannot handle other people's freedom, you become dangerous, and you become really dangerous if you have political power, and you become really extremely dangerous if you have absolute political power and cannot handle other people's freedom.
Yeah. Which is what we're witnessing, I guess. I suppose I imagine there's a great deal of dissonance in many people in Russia just now, because they're hearing one version of events, they don't really believe it, or they feel they have to believe it somehow to feel safe and secure, and to I wouldn't want to speculate, but somehow I can imagine there's a lot of difficulty in making sense as a Russian what to believe, what to feel.
You want to believe that Russia is the good guys,
Right.
and Russia has a lot of good guys. I mean, they're the majority of the people are good people.
Right.
And the majority of the Ukrainians are good people, and the majority of Danes are good people, and basically we're all good people. There's very, very few people who are not good people.
Yeah.
But a lot of us have a really bad, big problem with realizing whenever we're wrong, or whenever we have to change our mind, and whenever we just have to let other people, make their, have their distorted views on reality. So that there, I mean, we're back to the meaning making. And when Putin has attacked Ukraine now, it is because it makes more sense for him to do that than not to do that. Which sounds like a very silly observation, but is actually very profound, because if it had made more sense to him not to attack and invade Ukraine, there would not have been an invasion. So why does it make more sense to invade Ukraine than not to invade Ukraine? And that's meaning making. And
but we should
be all,
not to valorize meaning making, because you can make meaning in that way, and it's hugely destructive. It's just you're meeting a meaning need, but you can meet a meaning need and do all sorts of nefarious things.
Yep.
Well,
so I don't know how to. I mean, I do not have any answers to how we solve this, but we definitely have to stand up for peace and human rights, and democracy and freedom, and the freedom to have different viewpoints and different lifestyles, and being different in so many ways,
right?
And for other people to be too.
So that's interesting. So because I'm trying to put my finger on what exactly is that most needs to be defended, because there's territorial integrity, there's the rule of law, there's sort of more abstract things like democracy and human rights. But what you're getting at there is something about the fundamental, well, not right even, but value of being different somehow, having not being subsumable by the other mind, something like that being maybe the primary principle. It reminds me of the Iris Murdoch line about love is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. And much of what you're witnessing in this kind of totalitarian psychodrama playing out in the bombing of a European capital city and surrounding the whole country is an unwillingness to accept that something other than yourself is real. That Ukraine has its own dignity, autonomy, that's nothing to do with the current leader of Russia. It's all very challenging. I suppose we haven't gone into it in great analytical depth, but it is interesting to ask, if this is part of what it looks like for one historical epoch to sort of begin to end. But then you're like, well, as you mentioned, don't be too quick to say this is a kind of cleansing of the a sort of healthy ending to allow for new growth. It's not like that. It's you can destroy the land, right? You can destroy, you can make arid and unproductive the land on which the new world has to grow if you destroy too much of it. So for that reason, I certainly hope that the next few days and weeks play out in such a way that it looks like not only a heinous and immoral act, but also a really stupid one and self-defeating one. Time will tell, I guess.
I bet that there are Russian, top officials who see that invading Ukraine is hugely problematic, unethical, morally wrong, bad in every possible way.
Yeah.
And I bet that there are many Russians, ordinary Russians, who see it the same way.
Yeah.
And and these people need to have a voice.
Right. But
And
the problem is at the moment is they risk their freedom and their lives if
yes,
they use their voice. And yeah, I don't know how this will play out, but it's been good reflecting on it in some broader context. And we'll have to talk about the vegetable garden some other day.
we will return to that, and there has to be vegetable gardens. And I think if everybody went out and got a vegetable garden, we would be in a much better place in so many ways. And I'm not trying to make a joke out of this. I think this is extremely dangerous for all of us. But I also think that we need to prioritize differently, and we need to have a completely different political discourse. And we need to, I'm speaking from a Danish perspective, there has been way too much national focus in politics. And I'm not just talking about toxic nationalism, national chauvinism, and the bad stuff. The sense of how big the world is and where we need to engage and with whom we need to engage has been too limited for too long. And so Danish politics, and I bet British politics, have focused so much on our own state, our own country. And if everybody does that, then we're seeing things like this, because we could just as easily have had a much broader, bigger, deeper focus out into the rest of the world. And that, particularly in democracies, is limited by the willingness of the voters to, look beyond their own sort of nearest sphere of interest, and to actually vote for politicians who have a European agenda, a global agenda. And unless we do get involved continentally and globally with politics from the most prosperous part of the world and the most democratic part of the world, and if we do not create economic and democratic development in locally grown, and that's, you can call that a vegetable garden too, and in locally grown ways, we're not going to avoid the hypermodern future, and we're not going to be able to have a metamodern future. So we need to work on, at the cultural level, at the global level, at the, so many levels, and it's very complex, but that is a new time. And if
I'm just wondering if that's one.
If you and I mean, just one more thing, try to explain to your great grandmother in 1922 your everyday life. I mean, imagine you went on a time journey 100 years back and tried to explain to somebody in 1922 what we're doing right now. And the discussion we're having right now. You wouldn't even have the words for it.
No.
And so we have moved and made a tremendous intellectual, cultural journey. But you and I belong to a very small minority who have this intellectual conversation across a huge geographical distance. And it's your language, it's not mine. I mean, we're connecting in a way that very few people do in this world, but we have the access, we all have the access now, technologically. So something is changing profoundly. And there are doors opening to creating a world where we can have these conversations globally. And we need to have them. And they are out there. And we're organizing it in the Global Bildung Network. You're organizing it at Perspectiva. I mean, we're working on creating new venues for having these conversations and bringing more people into them. So there are things happening. The question is, how do we make this even more accessible, and how do we make it meaningful, not just to people with, all the privileges that you and I have and all the education that people have thrown at us, but also for people who may not be able to join in more than one language that is not English, for instance. So, I mean, we're facing some huge challenges, and then we're back to the meaning making and having these meetings and allowing people to meet and having these conversations that are conversations and not debates, but open, exploration of where are you coming from?
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I'm just wondering if, to sort of end this, one thing that I'm feeling now that I didn't feel before the start of the conversation is you can credibly and maybe quite fruitfully see the unfolding events in Ukraine as one of the battle lines, if not the front line, in this sort of underlying epochal battle between the metamodern and the hypermodern. I mean, it's a very abstract way of putting it when people are dying, but I mean, it can be seen in that way, that you're trying to preserve much of what was best of the world before in a rich, dynamic sort of.
There is something extremely metamodern coming out of Ukraine right now, actually a couple of weeks back, which is this year's contribution to the Eurovision Song Contest. So if you Google Ukraine Eurovision 2022, you have 300% metamodern.
Okay.
And I think we should share that link along with the video, because this is really amazing. And so you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a fault line between the old world and the new, and it somehow runs.
But what's particularly interesting about it, Lene, is that it is old world and new, but it, in a weird way, a lot of people are seeing this as a return to the Cold War, or they're seeing it as somehow an imperial venture, and it is those things. But vis-a-vis the connection with China, vis-a-vis authoritarian control, vis-a-vis use of technology, there's also a sense in which this is a darker future that, it's not so much going back to the past. It's actually, it's the anti-progress future in a sense. And that's why, one of the many reasons why it matters.
So the future, we need to decide which future we want, and we need to work for it, because there are forces within us, and they're within all of us, that are really dark and that are afraid of the new, and that want to go back to what we know. And it's a basic human need, and I don't think we should deny it. I don't think we should say it's a bad thing, but we do need to recognize it. And we also, and that's why I think the metamodernity that actually insists on bringing along with us that pre-modern heritage in a fruitful way, in a constructive way, and also the prehistoric indigenous, because that's where we can connect with nature. And so we can have that emotional or spiritual, or whatever you want to call it, but deep connection with being part of nature as human beings. And through that, we can actually, save the planet, so it's a livable place.
Yeah, hence the case for the vegetable garden, just to come back.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. Let's leave it there, Lene. Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.